All right, today we're jumping into a question that has sparked, well, literally centuries of debate within Islamic history. We're going to break down the work of author J.R. Ahmed, who tackles a subject where tradition and scripture seem to go head to head. And it all starts with the age of the Prophet Muhammad's most famous wife.
So here's the question at the heart of it all. Was Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, a child, or was she a woman when she got married? And look, this isn't just some historical footnote. It's a major flashpoint for debate, both inside and outside the Muslim world.
So where does all this come from? Well, it points back to this one specific tradition, what's known as a Hadith, which is a recorded saying or action of the Prophet. This one is found in Sahih Bukhari, one of the most respected collections out there. And for centuries, this has been the story most people know. A marriage contract at 6 and consummation at 9.
But here's the thing. According to the author we're looking at today, this tradition isn't just a historical detail. It's a massive problem, one that they argue really impacts the very perception of Islam's prophet.
And the author is really upfront about why they're tackling this. They argue that this specific tradition provides, in their words, ammunition to the enemies of Islam. So their whole goal is to challenge that narrative directly.
So, how do they go about building this case? Well, their core method is actually pretty straightforward. They use the Quran itself as the ultimate test. The logic is simple. If a traditional saying seems to contradict a clear principle in the scripture, then the scripture has to take precedence.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because you see this direct comparison laid out. On one hand, you have the Hadith, which implies a marriage contract for a 6-year-old, but on the other hand, the Quran calls marriage a very solemn pledge. So the author asks, how can a child who doesn't have a full understanding of the world possibly enter into such a serious, binding contract?
And the argument keeps building from there. The source points us to another Quranic principle, this one in verse 4:6, and it explicitly says that marriage requires reaching an age of sound judgment, or Rusd. The key here, for the author, is that this isn't just about physical puberty. It's about mental and emotional maturity.
So this word, Rusd, what does it actually mean? According to the author's analysis of the term, it's way more than just knowing right from wrong. It's the ability to reason, to solve problems, to judge situations correctly. A level of maturity that the author argues a young child just doesn't have yet. Then, the author points to what they see as a huge linguistic clue. They highlight that throughout the Quran, whenever it talks about marriage, the word it uses is nisa, which means women. The text, according to this source, never uses a word that would mean girls or children when talking about who to marry.
All right, so you might be thinking, okay, but what about that one verse? There's a common counter-argument that comes from chapter 65, verse 4. It talks about a waiting period after divorce for women who have not menstruated. And yeah, that has often been interpreted to include prepubescent girls. So how does the author deal with that?
Well, the author's rebuttal here is pretty detailed. First off, they point out that the verse, once again, uses the word nisa, women. Second, they say not menstruating can easily refer to adult women who have medical conditions, like amenorrhea. But here's the real clincher, according to the source. The same verse goes on to talk about the possibility of pregnancy. A prepubescent child can't get pregnant. So, in the author's view, that interpretation is just logically impossible.
Okay, so that's the whole argument from scripture. But the author doesn't just leave it there. They bring in a totally different line of reasoning, one based on historical timelines. The claim is that if you actually look at the known ages of Aisha's own family, the traditional story just doesn't add up.
And this slide really lays it all out. Let's just walk through it together because it's pretty straightforward. We start with historical reports that say Aisha's sister, Asma, was 10 years older. Okay. Then other sources say Asma was 27 during the Hijrah. That's the big migration to Medina. So you just do the math. That would make Aisha 17 at that same time. Since the marriage was consummated 2 years later, this calculation puts her age at 19.
This table from the source is, well, it's pretty striking. It just lays out all the different possibilities. The author gives them these labels. The traditional 9-year-old story is called the ugly. Other reports that suggest 16 are the bad. The calculation we just did, based on her sister, that gets us to 19, that's labeled better. But then there's this other account, which the author calls the good, suggesting she was actually a 48-year-old widow, which would definitely fit with the Quranic focus on marrying widows.
So after laying out all this evidence from scripture, from history, the author is ready to make their final call, to deliver a clear and unambiguous verdict on that traditional account.
So, to sum it all up, here's why the author rejects that hadith. 1, it flat out contradicts the Quran's own standards for maturity in marriage. 2, it doesn't line up with her own family's timeline. 3, and this is a really fascinating point, the Prophet's biggest enemies who criticized him for everything apparently never said a word about this. And finally, the Prophet himself set a precedent that a 14-year-old boy was too young for battle, but 15 was okay.
And to really hammer this point home, the author brings in this incredibly powerful quote from a classical scholar, Ibn al-Qayyim. The idea here is that any rule or tradition that leads away from core values like justice, mercy, and wisdom, it doesn't matter where it came from, it simply can't be part of the true faith.
So what's the big takeaway here? According to the source material, it's this. The hadith that reports Aisha's age as 6 and 9 is, in the author's view, a total fabrication, and it must be rejected in favor of what they present as the much clearer, more consistent evidence from the Quran and from just plain historical reason. And all of this leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? It's something that people in many different faiths have to grapple with. When a tradition you've held for a long time seems to clash with the core principles of your scripture, which one gets the final say?